We all have that one character in our favorite show that sticks out for one reason or another. Maybe they're a really funny character, or really charming, or epic. Someone who you could aspire to be like. Maybe they're a really tragic character, and although they may act or do things you know you'd never do, you can't help but feel something for them. Well, the character I want to talk about is not just someone who I can understand as a general audience member, but one that I can find myself strongly relating to on an emotional and even a psychological level. I grew up pretty much physically attached to the show Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, and was utterly immersed in the fantastic world created by Wilbert Awdry and realized for television by Britt Allcroft and David Mitton. So funnily enough, when anyone would ask me to name my favorite character, it was almost impossible for me to pick just one. One week it could be Toby the Tram Engine, the next it could be Duck the Great Western Engine. I could never decide for sure. And this was not unfounded. Each character held a special place in my heart for one reason or another. With the way the show worked, each character had at least several stories highlighting an incredible or endearing aspect of theirs. Even so, I still found myself resonating more with one above all others. And for the 80th anniversary of the show, I would like to go in depth on my favorite character, Henry the Green Engine, who was always in the back of my mind all those times I was asked that question. His story is one of tragedy and triumph, but also cycles. While I was a kid, I found myself connecting more with the tragedy. As an adult, I see that there are larger themes that make that connection more apparent, telling me more about Henry and myself as a whole. In this video, I would like to recount Henry's story and then analyze his character through the lens of social pressure and masking to present why I find this character to be so relatable. I would then like to use our findings here to offer some commentary on social norms and how we as people can cope or improve them. Henry was one of the first 3 characters created by Awdry, aptly appearing in the first ever book, The 3 Railway Engines. And just so we can fulfill this rule of 3 here, Henry is, in fact, the number 3 engine on the island. I had to do it. I'm sorry. Anyways, Henry's story starts with his infamous tunnel incident in The Sad Story of Henry, where he sticks in a tunnel and refuses to budge despite the efforts of everyone. Why? Because he doesn't want his paint to get wet. Yep, that's it. And people tried to use this as evidence for why Sodor is some kind of hellscape. He is then redeemed in the next story by rescuing a train from a broken down Gordon. After that point, Henry didn't fill such a big role in the succeeding books until his own because of, well, let's just call them technical difficulties. The story goes that Awdry had originally illustrated Henry to be a middle-sized engine to fit in between Edward the smaller and kind one and Gordon, the bigger and more self-important one. However, when it came time for the official books to be illustrated, the artists kept drawing him in a way that resembled Gordon far too much for Awdry's liking. This annoyed him so much so that he was planning to get rid of Henry entirely until children made it clear that they really loved him and wanted him to stay. We then make our way to Henry's very own book in the series, where he goes through his most important arc. Now, leading up to this entry, Henry had been plagued with illness, keeping him out of more lead roles and becoming the subject of a lot of teasing or disparagement from engines, big or small. So when it came time for Henry's book, it was time for him to get a second chance, both in the meta sense and in the stories themselves. Sir Topham Hatt, who has had so much trouble with Henry at this point, decides that despite this, he wants to give Henry that chance by providing him with special coal to help his performance. This would not last, however, as in the next story, Henry would go through his most infamous incident, the Flying Kipper crash.
Was that the Kipper of 87?
This would result in him getting completely rebuilt and solidifying his place on the railway. This is a very brief rendition of it, but this first arc for Henry marks a lot for his character, namely his struggles with self-worth and belonging. We see how his health and troubled origins hinder him from getting a stable role on the island, unlike Gordon or Thomas, who only had to overcome their own egos. And it takes Henry having to be completely rebuilt in order to find his footing, which honestly says a lot about normalization and normalcy in society. Henry's magnum opus, let's call it, comes in the renowned railway story Super Rescue, which many have touted as one of the greatest. When 2 diesels come to the island and one of them acts horribly to the others, we find Henry, whose regulator had jammed before the start of this story, has to rescue both diesels, pulling 2 trains at once. Again, yes, this is a very simple summary, but I think the point here is to illustrate just how far Henry has come since his days as the sick one, and proves himself as one of Sodor's enterprising engines. While what he does in his book is a great redemption arc, here we have a moment that tells us that, yeah, he's still got it. And honestly, yeah, It's a good feeling to be reassured that all of the struggle Henry went through back in his early days meant something, and that Henry overcame those issues with no more doubt about his worth. So the Railway series gave Henry a good run, and he ended strong. However, that's not the version of the character that I feel myself resonating the most with. Thus, we enter the television era, where for the most part, Henry's stories follow the same beats, and we get to the same place by season 2. Our key difference here comes in season 3, where Allcroft and Minton decided to add some stories written by some other writers into the mix. One such story saw Henry become a nature lover who finds solace in one particular forest on the railway, and becomes sad when a storm ravages the forest, knocking down some trees. This episode in particular is notorious for how it made Wilbur Awdry himself react, as he adamantly claimed that this made no sense in the world he had created. Yet again, it seems we find Henry's identity strained by his own creator, which once again confuses his character as a whole. It really is quite something to behold on a metatextual level, but I think it's a quality that no other character in this franchise shares with Henry. This nature-loving quality to Henry is less explored, unfortunately, and as for why, I'm not sure. Maybe the criticism from Awdry had something to do with it, we don't know for sure. So this quality would rarely see any attention from that point on, save for a few mentions here and there. Even in the later hit entertainment era that acted as a softer reboot, Henry only has about one episode where he wishes on a tree, but his love for nature is never explained as a point of continuity. So we have what is basically a one-off in Henry's life, and yet it remains so meaningful and stands out for many reasons that I would like to expand on in this video. As we discussed, Henry's story for the most part followed that of the books, and with that came his vanity and mob mentality with Gordon and James, who consider themselves the bigger engines, who banded together to express their indignation over things that they saw as beneath them.
Tender engines don't shunt.
James the Red Engine in particular has some interesting qualities he shares with Henry that I think merit attention here. Looking at the both of them on a surface level, it becomes hard to distinguish them individually. When we take a look behind the scenes, knowing that Henry was supposed to be the middle-sized engine, I think would explain why they share those qualities. They're both vain, they both follow Gordon's bad example, and they both care a lot for their self-image. I would just like to say that Henry cared about his paintwork first. He was the OG, okay? Knowing this, I would say this gentle giant part of Henry that came from Andrew Brenner, the original writer of Henry's Forest, is a good way of subverting our expectations of what we know is usual for the bigger engines on Sodor. I also think it presents a fascinating contradiction to Henry. Let us not forget here that he is a steam engine, a machine. And while I don't agree with Awdry's sentiment, he raises a good question. Why would a steam locomotive have any interest in these things? Especially something that is kind of harmed by his very existence, you know what I mean? And yeah, while it makes sense for James to be obsessed with his paintwork, or understandable for Duck to be curious about what lies out at sea, Henry being in love with a forest seems almost like the complete opposite of what a steam engine is accustomed to. I mean, he's either in the middle of a bustling goods yard, or rushing down the line watching scenery come and go. The only rest he gets being at the sheds where the other engines are, and plenty of other rolling stock. An industrial setting through and through. So why the forest? What could Henry get out of this place that makes it worth his while to go there out of his way after work just to bask in it? And why do I believe that the peace he finds in the forest is arguably more satisfying than what takes place in the story of Super Rescue? Well, I would like to offer my explanation in this video, and hopefully you can see where I'm coming from. Now, going through his story, I think it's pretty clear that Henry has been through the ringer in his life. And I would say this could give anyone trouble with self-esteem in their lives, especially when those around them give them a hard time for it. I would like to make the case for why both of these factors drive Henry to the forest for a sense of peace, and also why they cause him to socially mask. Now, if you watched my video on James, I'm sure you're asking, really? We're talking about masking again?
Oh, really? Exclaimed Percy. I am surprised.
Like this is going to be some kind of cop-out. And yes, we are talking about masking, but I find this case to be unique. 1, because I'm not going to deny being biased for Henry, and 2, because I think the characters are distinct enough in both personality and their reasons for masking to warrant this explanation. In my James video, I did talk a lot about masking, but I don't think I did a good job defining it. So for this video, I would like to work with the definition Miller et al. Provides in their article. Masking is a term used by the autistic community to describe the suppression of aspects of self and identity to fly under the radar or appear normal, using conscious or unconscious unconscious means. We use masking as an umbrella term to capture experiences that have been referred to as camouflaging, compensation, and adaptive morphing. For the television version of Henry's character, I would like to posit that how we view Henry in the first 7 seasons exhibits some of these aspects due to the social environment of Sodor. I think there is naturally some nuance here, and the traits we see from Henry, such as vanity or pompousness, seem to be inherent for him, but behaviors like throwing insults or belittling others, I believe, is learned behavior Henry takes on in order to fit in, and in some way mask in front of others. Going back to James and his relationship to Vanity, we talked about how being a narcissist makes James addicted to self-esteem, and so he is always seeking to look good or get one over on another individual, from small conversation to social status. This is in contrast to Henry, who I don't believe is in constant pursuit of image for the sake of chasing some high, but because of past experiences dictating to him that he has to work harder to appear normal and to be accepted. Put it simply, in separating the two, James has an addiction to self-esteem, whereas Henry has a reliance on it. As an aside, I think it's important we illustrate what Henry's social milieu is in order to understand how I believe he is masking inside of it. It's been well documented at this point that Audrey's intention when writing these stories was to write each of the characters like actual children, using his own experience as a child and of his own observations. In episodes like Down the Mine or Percy Takes the Plunge, characters deliberately disobey danger signs because, as Audrey puts it,
like children faced with a prohibition, as every child does, they push it and push it and push it to see how far they can go without bringing trouble on themselves.
When children are told not to do something, they want to do it more. Similarly, children can also be difficult or rude, as we see in stories where Henry stubbornly stays in the tunnel, and Gordon makes fun of Edward for being old. The latter quality is what I think has determined the way Henry has adapted around the others, because he is constantly surrounded by all of these massive egos who use words and insults to show social power or social dominance. In these stories, one of the most important aspects of the material comes from the characters and how they interact with one another. So it is often what we get the most exposure to. Knowing that there seems to be this social pressure in the early years of Sodor, it seems logical that for one to make it by, one needs to conform or suppress parts of themselves. Very much like real life. When looking at the reasons why individuals often mask, Miller, Rees, and Pearson also found in their own work, participants in this study referred to external social influence as the main driving factor in masking, including self-protection, fear of repercussion, and negative consequences, which is consistent with previous research. Personally, I've also felt this way in social situations, and I know I'm not alone. There is this anxiety inside of me that says to suppress certain things because I worry they would make me seem strange or undesirable. With Henry, I think it came down to his unfortunate health situation, something that was completely out of his control, and is actually explained by Audrey as Henry's design coming from stolen plans for Gordon's class prototype, which is why Henry had trouble in his original shape and was rebuilt later on in the series. We see Henry looked down upon by his peers for lamenting his illness in those early seasons, and even later on in season 7's What's the Matter with Henry, Henry is hit hard with this feeling of what could be considered just outright depression, because it's sort of a relapse for him. And to add literal insult to injury, when he feels his physical condition has returned to such a low, his situation gets worse when Thomas and Percy tease him for it, returning him to that cycle. I'd also like to use this moment to address one point made in the Unlucky Tugs video about Henry, which is super good, obviously, and I highly recommend, where he says that Henry gets a pseudo-super rescue moment here, because despite his worsening condition, he goes on to pull an extraordinary length of coal trucks, which on the surface would be really cool because it shows how determined and strong he is. However, there's one line in the episode that I think highlights the problem here.
Useful engines don't complain.
When I was going back through these episodes and watching Henry's story through all 7 seasons, it honestly broke my heart to see that this was how Henry learned to cope with his health. From my perspective, it seems to me that to Henry, the only course he knows how to take in these kinds of circumstances is to be nasty in order to reciprocate the attitudes around him, or to suppress like we see here, so as not to be made fun of. This is another phenomenon that occurs when socially masking. As Larsen et al. Explains, trying not to show emotions or perceived faults may also be a goal-oriented attempt to prevent additional victimization among adolescents who experience depressive symptoms. Henry tells himself that only useful engines don't complain, as a way to remind himself what his complaining got him when he was first sick. One example that sticks out very painfully to me is what Thomas said to him in Thomas and the Guard.
"Oh dear, my system is out of order. No one understands my case. You don't know what I suffer," moaned Henry. "Rubbish," said Thomas. "You're too fat. You need exercise."
Something that's just plain malicious, especially when Henry was genuinely suffering then, and honestly stands out to me as Audrey's own discontent with his character, which adds this whole other layer of sadness to it. This instance is only made worse by the fact that it's Thomas who is teasing Henry for complaining once again in season 7, invalidating his feelings and really bringing it full circle for him. I think this kind of environment is why Henry is usually so coarse around everyone. It is genuinely hard to rise above that kind of behavior when it's all you know. It's easier to fight fire with fire when you don't know if there's any water. Okay, maybe that's stupid. I don't know. Point being, it's a cycle, and he's trapped in this cycle. When we look at another example in season 5's The Trouble with Trees, with a scene showing us Henry trying to genuinely warn James about the dangers of trees only to be made fun of and ignored. Again, we see Henry being punched down on, and what's worse, the one aspect of himself that he finds comfort in is used against him. I think this all drives home the idea that Henry is socially mistreated, and I would go on to say that he is looked down on by some. This cycle of mistreatment shows us that for Henry, he's not in a safe space all the time, so he must adapt his behaviors to be similar to those of Gordon, James, or Thomas, because that seems to be the only way for him to be heard, from his perspective at least. The anxiety of not having a safe space causes him to mask or behave like the others, as this anxiety caused by social camouflaging could also reflect the lack of a safe space to exhibit one's full identity, another common experience noted in qualitative research. Additionally, the social hierarchy he finds himself in only serves to make him feel more socially outcasted, to the point that only being alone with the trees gives him any peace. As Lawson states, when we feel or are socially different, we viscerally and intuitively know that this increases the risk of group separation or exclusion. This exposes us to increased social, emotional, and physical risk and harm. So adaptive morphing is a state that attempts to hide us from harm, enabling us to stay and feel safe. This emerges, especially in autism, not from an inherent or even conscious desire to deceive or pretend, but from a desire for survival. Henry has dealt with so much and is constantly surrounded by people who foster an environment that requires thick skin, or metal. I think part of Henry's mask is giving in to his vanity and harshness towards others because that's what's expected. He acts this way not always consciously, but by habit, and his immediate social circle hasn't taught him any way to change that. Now, the difficulty in making this claim is this. When Henry first came to the island, his vanity got him stuck in the tunnel. So how can Henry act vain and rude after the tunnel incident if this vanity was what caused the incident in the first place? And I would say this is exactly the nuance of Henry's character, that he was brought into a tumultuous situation, being a stolen design and deemed difficult to work with, and acting out, resulting in a rather traumatic situation like that one. How I interpret this situation is that Henry is like a child here, who goes to the extreme over something that seems menial to other adult figures, like his paintwork. While his attitude is an issue, I think we may look at Henry's sensitivity to his paintwork as possibly a result of having autism spectrum disorder. Something that is also common in those with ASD is exhibiting traits or behaviors that are perceived as socially frowned on. Naturally, no one could blame the passengers for being upset that their train was delayed for hours on end because of Henry's vanity, but Henry inevitably ends up learning the hard way that acting like this is not acceptable, and reflects a more internal journey he goes through in the understanding of his relationship to his environment. During this time, I would say Henry was likely flushed with a whirlwind of emotions ranging from anger to depression. Add to this the pressure of trying to prove himself any chance he could get after finally recovering from his physical shortcomings, only to have another traumatic event when he crashed pulling the flying kipper. And I would argue it's difficult to separate those feelings of stress and frustration from those who constantly bring it up to tease you about it in that same environment. Not to mention constantly being around engines like Thomas, Percy, and James, and many others who are always bickering and always teasing each other, which makes it harder to step away from those tendencies. In a case like the Big Engines group that Henry has always been tied up with through the years, I see it as him feeling this need to conform to similar engines, ones who are vain, to take some of his own life back. If he's going to be shamed for his health issues and basically who he is, then he should be associated with those in power or with social status, namely Gordon, so as to feel some sort of control. He uses masking as a way to blend in with those who would abuse him in hopes that he won't be the one on the receiving end.
What's the matter, Henry? There's no rain today. Stop worrying and do some work instead. I'm not afraid of getting wet anymore, huffed Henry. Anyway, you look silly enough to be a clown. You should join the circus.
I also find it really interesting that Henry does in fact gravitate towards Gordon, who he was supposed to be modeled after, but maintains a rivalry with him over being the bigger engines and pulling the Express, to name a few examples. But Gordon is also the first engine we know who created this relationship of abuse for Henry. When he's in the tunnel, all Gordon can say to him is,
"Poop, poop, poop. Serves you right."
So when we find Henry in later stories indulging in that same kind of behavior, it is clear to me that he is perpetuating that cycle only to his own detriment. Not just in a moral way, as Henry will, like most characters, receive his comeuppance when acting vain, but he also suffers internally by suppressing that inner self. And as further research tells us, several participants across groups also spoke about how masking could lead to invalidation of their identity and minimize some of their personal challenges. This is what makes the show's interpretation of Henry so interesting to me, because while he cares about his social status and image in front of others, acting foolishly at times, he has this secret side to him as a nature lover, and I believe that the one-off nature of that story is a result of the character suppressing that part of himself in front of others. At least that's how I read it. Henry socially masking in front of the other engines makes him relatable and interesting to me. We have seen Henry happy before, sure, like pulling the kipper when he doesn't crash, getting his new coal, and other achievements, but I think these are all moments where Henry has had to overcome and struggle in order to get to this point, which is great for sure. It's a great character building tool, putting an obstacle in front of your character and them reaching the other side of it, sure. But finding some peace in this forest tells us that there is something in this world he can turn to that doesn't require a challenge or strain in order for him to find joy from it. While Henry doesn't get his big super rescue moment in the show, I would say finding this forest gives him a resolution just as satisfying that doesn't rely on external validation for his own happiness. Unfortunately, when looking at the show, there is no getting around the fact that Henry continues to mask and continues the cycle of abuse in his own social circle, and that takes a toll. As funny or relatable as these interactions the characters share are, there's something just not right to me when it happens to Henry. There's this sort of injustice to it. What's worse is that I feel the show did a disservice to his character by never really exploring that aspect to it. It's why watching What's the Matter with Henry made me sad, because after Henry's Forest, it seemed like Henry's character never got to go anywhere. And in fact, you could say he regressed, as the writers chose to rely on his illness as a defining trait. Within the text, there is no resolution to Henry's internal struggle here, and that loss of identity, as Miller classifies it, and the experience of grief was common among participants who described the impact of feeling like they did not know their true selves, or wondered who they could have been if they had not felt the need to mask. Henry's own identity is eclipsed by the perceived social pressure around him and his fear of being totally outcasted. In a funny way, I think that's why Henry struggled to stand out to later writers throughout the years, because Henry himself couldn't allow his softer side out in the open. I can't imagine the emotional toll that has been taken on Henry, and we may never fully know after all. Considering what he's been through, I can only hope that the forest provides comfort enough to help him process these wounds. It's also a shame that the show never let us explore relationships he could have had with Toby or Terrence, who helped him rebuild that forest after the storm, and who sympathized with the issue. On a more personal note, I feel the most connected to this version of Henry since I see a lot of my child's self in him. Someone who struggled, not only physically but socially, and acted harshly because it seemed like the only option, especially when those around me fed into those habits. But alone, by myself, I felt like a completely different person with an entirely different side I kept to myself. Where Henry could escape to his forest and let go of his pressures or anxieties, I escaped into the world of Thomas the Tank Engine. I can say now that I'm in a much better place and I've made great strides to attain a more holistic lifestyle, but that took a lot of effort. It meant being able to recognize and process the things I was feeling healing and cultivating a sound support system with the friends and loved ones around me. It also took a lot of courage to confront those issues and make sure I was doing what was right for me. And this is what I mean when I think Henry's character can help us reflect on our own social norms. Because there are so many unspoken rules, so many things you just do and not know why.
It isn't wrong, but we just don't do it.
So what's important over everything is to communicate with people and make sure your voice is heard so that you're not suppressing, so that you're not holding it in and hiding behind a mask that doesn't represent the version of you that you want people to see. Henry will always be my favorite character because of the part of me that I see in him, and recognizing that what I once felt about myself has since passed, and knowing that it's possible for me to reach a better place lets me know that the television version of Henry, the one that I see in my mind, could absolutely reach that same place. I know that someday he really could have his super rescue and save himself too. Okay. I realize that's kind of a heavy note to end it on, and we got very deep here in this video. The video that's supposed to be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Thomas the Tank Engine, but I feel like for this occasion, I wanted to go really deep into what makes this world so special to me, and especially about the character who I resonate the most with. I would love to hear your thoughts and connections to this topic and to Henry or any other character that makes you feel this way. And let me know who's your favorite and why. You obviously don't have to go like as in depth as I do, and it doesn't have to be like a really personal story or anything, but you know, I still like the discussion, and just let me know. With that though, I want to say thank you for watching, and happy anniversary to Thomas the Tank Engine and all of his friends. Thank you.